Imagine, if you will, the city of Rome. Not the Rome of today, mind you, with its charming Vespa-clogged streets and charmingly overpriced gelato. No, picture Rome at the zenith of its power. The year is, let's say 117 AD. Trajan's column is still box fresh. The Colosseum echoes with the roar of gladiators, not tourists. And the toga is very much in vogue. The streets teem with life. Senators in their flowing robes, merchants hawking exotic wares from the far corners of the empire, and the occasional legionary, fresh from conquering some distant land, probably wondering where he could get a decent plate of dormice. The air, thick with the scent of olive oil, freshly baked bread, and just a hint of something vaguely gladiatorial, vibrates with the energy of a civilization at its peak. This was not just a city, it was the beating heart of a vast empire. A dominion that stretched from the sun-drenched shores of North Africa to the mist-shrouded hills of Britannia. An empire, it's fair to say, that had rather a lot going for it. But as we know, all good things, even empires with excellent plumbing, must eventually come to an end. And this, my friends, is the story of how Rome fell. Well, the western half at least. The eastern half had a good run, but that's a tale for another time, preferably after a nice cup of tea. Now let's rewind a bit, shall we? Back to our friend Trajan, the chap with the rather impressive column. Trajan, you see, was what one might call a go-getter. He wasn't content to just sit around in Rome, lounging about in his toga and issuing stern edicts. No, Trajan was an emperor of action, a man who liked nothing more than a good conquest. Under his rule, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from modern-day Scotland in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. You see, Trajan was a firm believer in the Roman art of pacification, which, loosely translated, meant if you're not already part of the Roman Empire, prepare to be pacified, possibly with swords. He campaigned tirelessly, expanding Rome's borders and filling the imperial coffers with plunder. He built roads, aqueducts, and cities, all with a characteristic Roman efficiency and a dash of architectural grandeur. He was, in short, the kind of emperor they'd write epic poems about, assuming, of course, the poets weren't too busy being conquered by some other ambitious emperor. But alas, even the mightiest of empires are not immune to the laws of economics. After Trajan's reign, things began to, shall we say, unravel a bit. The constant wars, while undoubtedly good for the Roman ego, had put a rather large dent in the imperial treasury. It turns out that running an empire, what with all the legions to pay and the roads to build, is a rather expensive business. Who knew? The Romans, being resourceful chaps, tried to solve this problem the way any self-respecting empire would, by debasing the currency. They started minting denarii with less and less silver, hoping nobody would notice. Spoiler alert, people noticed. Inflation soared, the economy sputtered, and suddenly, those once shiny denarii weren't worth the silver they were barely printed on. It was enough to make even the most stoic of senators reach for their abacuses in despair. As if economic woes weren't enough, the Romans also had to contend with the small matter of, well, everyone else. Beyond the carefully patrolled borders of the empire lurked a motley collection of tribes and peoples, all with their own ideas about how things should be run. And by run, I mean not by the Romans. There were the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths. The Goths really need to work on their branding. The Vandals, the Huns, and a whole host of other groups with names that sound like they were made up by someone trying to clear their throat. These barbarians, as the Romans charmingly called them, were getting restless. They looked at the increasingly fragile Roman Empire and saw not an invincible superpower, but a rather tempting target. Section 5. Diocletian's Dilemma: One Empire, Two Heads, Not Better Than One. By the time Diocletian, a man with a face that launched 1,000 statues, most of them frowning, became emperor in 284 AD, the writing was on the wall, literally, if you count the graffiti complaining about the price of bread. Diocletian, a practical sort, realized that the empire had become simply too big, too unwieldy for one man to handle. So he did what any sensible emperor on the verge of a nervous breakdown would do. He split the empire in two. The Western Roman Empire, with its capital in, you guessed it, Rome, would cover the western half of the old empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in the fabulously named Constantinople, try saying that 5 times fast after a goblet of Roman wine, would take care of the East. It seemed like a good idea at the time, a bit like deciding to share a particularly large pizza with a friend. But as we all know, even the best laid plans, especially those involving pizza, often go awry. Section 6. Crumbling columns and crumbling morals. The empire rots from within. The problems, however, went deeper than just economics and troublesome neighbors. Rome, it seemed, was also experiencing a bit of an identity crisis. The old virtues of discipline, hard work, and not invading your neighbors, at least not all the time, were starting to fade like a cheap toga in a rainstorm. The Roman elite, more interested in extravagant banquets and gladiatorial games than in actually, governing, had embraced a lifestyle that can only be described as decadent, even by modern standards. Corruption was rife. The gap between the rich and the poor was wider than a chariot race track, and the once renowned Roman legions were now filled with more mercenaries and conscripts than actual, Romans. It was all a bit depressing, really. Section 7. The Fall, but not quite how one half of Rome lived to see another day. And so, in 476 AD, after centuries of glory, intrigue, and more than its fair share of toga parties, the Western Roman Empire finally breathed its last. The last Roman emperor, a chap named Romulus Augustulus, who ironically enough shared his name with both the founder of Rome and a mythical figure raised by a wolf, was deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer. The once mighty Roman Empire in the West was no more. The Eastern Roman Empire, however, the one with the cool capital and the slightly less chaotic management style, proved to be a bit more resilient. It would live on for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire, preserving much of Roman culture, law, and most importantly, the recipe for decent plumbing. They weren't big on togas though, which is a shame. Section 8. Lessons from the Rubble. What happens when you build an empire on bad pizza? So what can we learn from the fall of the Roman Empire, apart from the fact that it's probably not a good idea to build a civilization on a foundation of conquest, corruption, and an over-reliance on lead pipes? Well, for one, even the greatest empires are not immune to the forces of history. Power, like a plate of lukewarm dormice, is a dish best served cautiously and never ever debase your currency. The fall of Rome also reminds us that even in the midst of decline there is always hope. After all, the eastern half of the empire did manage to survive for another 1,000 years, which, when you think about it, is a pretty good innings. So, the next time you're feeling pessimistic about the state of the world, remember the Roman Empire. It rose, it fell, it had a good run, and in the grand scheme of things, isn't that all any of us can really hope for? That and a decent slice of pizza. Hold the dormice, though.